When shadows from the past start to close in, it can feel like everything around you is set in stone. Can a person ever truly escape what fate has in store for them? Today's story is about a family that disappeared overnight, leaving behind a string of unanswered questions and the lonely echoes of unfinished phone calls. This is the story of Melissa Wolfenberger, which began with a sudden, unexplained disappearance and turned into a true tragedy. It was November 26, 1998, when a quiet Thanksgiving evening at the Patton household was overshadowed by a sense of unease. Melissa, the youngest daughter of Norma and Carl, called to wish her parents a happy Thanksgiving. The conversation was typical, familiar, discussing plans for the upcoming holidays, choosing gifts, and preparing for Christmas. Melissa wanted her children to spend the holidays at her parents' house, as they did every year. "Mom, don't forget that old photo of Grandma. I'd love to have it framed under the tree," she said with a smile. But when Christmas came, there was no phone call, no knock on the door. Norma and Carl were worried, but still held out hope that their daughter and her family would show up at the last minute, as they sometimes did. But as the hours passed, no one arrived. Gifts lay beneath the tree, twinkling with festive lights, but the mood was somber as the silence grew deafening. It all started on an ordinary day. But soon, concern began to grip Norma, as several days went by without a word from their daughter. Melissa had always found a way to reach out, especially if plans had changed, but this time, it seemed different. The parents tried calling, but there was no answer. Attempts to get in touch with their son-in-law, Christopher, were also unsuccessful. Since they had their grandchildren, Melissa and her husband, along with their kids, lived in Atlanta, while Melissa's parents stayed in their cozy home in Last Grove, Georgia. In January, after the prolonged silence became unbearable, Norma and Carl got in their car and drove to Atlanta. They took the familiar streets leading to the duplex on Brooklyn Avenue, but what they found there made their hearts sink. The apartment doors were open, but inside everything felt eerily empty and lifeless. The rooms were spotless, perfectly arranged, as if their daughter and her family had never lived there. It was as though someone had deliberately erased all traces of their existence. Norma went door to door, asking neighbors if they had seen Melissa or her children. One man recalled seeing them loading items into a moving truck shortly before New Year's, but no one knew where they were headed or why they hadn't left any forwarding address or message. It was as if they had decided to leave abruptly, without warning and with no plans to return. For Norma and Carl, it was unbearable. They knew that if something was wrong, Melissa would have definitely reached out to them. Their daughter had always been open and honest, and if plans had changed, she wouldn't have kept it a secret. Norma decided that they couldn't just let this go. If Melissa and her family had left, then someone had to know something. They tracked down the company where their son-in-law worked. It was a glass manufacturing firm, and management confirmed that Christopher had indeed been employed there as a truck driver, but he had recently been let go. The reason for his dismissal was that he had been involved in an accident with one of the company vehicles. When asked about Christopher's future plans, they couldn't provide any answers. He had simply vanished, just like his family. Time passed, but there were no updates in January or February. Norma kept trying to reach out, but each new day brought only a fresh wave of disappointment. Her birthday in February was especially painful. Melissa had always called to wish her well, even if she was busy. But this time, the phone remained silent. Norma finally began to realize that her daughter's silence wasn't accidental. Something terrible had happened. What could have driven Melissa to abandon her previous life? Norma and Carl struggled to make sense of it. They remembered how their youngest daughter was always cheerful and loving. From a young age, she stood out among her peers, actively participating in school beauty pageants and helping her older sister Tina with her projects. Together, they had dreamed of opening a veterinary clinic to rescue as many animals as possible. But those dreams faded into the past when Melissa's teenage rebellion led her into trouble. Legal issues, running away from home, and her first serious love. Christopher became her only anchor during those turbulent years when she was torn between parental rules and a desire to find herself. Marriage changed her. It seemed like things were finally coming together. She moved to the city with Christopher, had children, and their life appeared to be happy. But her parents still sensed something subtle, something unsettling, as if beneath the surface calm, there was a deep crack. And now, in January 1999, standing in that empty apartment on Brooklyn Avenue, those uneasy feelings had turned into a chilling reality. The questions kept piling up. What had happened to their daughter and her family? Why did all the leads go nowhere? And why did their attempts to find answers only lead to dead ends? Why had none of the neighbors seen Melissa after New Year's, and where had her children gone? And what was the significance of that photograph she had wanted for Christmas? These seemingly minor, insignificant details took on a sinister tone, creating the sense that something much larger was at play. Leaving it all unresolved would have felt like betrayal, and Norma kept searching for any information, grasping at the smallest clues to understand what had happened to her beloved daughter. A story that had begun with a simple family holiday had transformed into a grim, desperate attempt to find light in the darkness, and nothing could have prepared her for the truth that lay ahead. A truth that would turn their lives upside down. Melissa's older sister, Tina, who worked with her at a small bakery, was just as puzzled by her disappearance. The management at Denny's, where they worked, reported that Melissa hadn't shown up for over a month, and her coworkers said she simply stopped coming around, almost as if she had vanished into thin air. No one knew if she had gotten another job. They only mentioned that one day she didn't show up for her shift and didn't give any notice. Some of her coworkers even visited her home, but it was no use. Neighbors just shrugged, saying the family had moved out, but no one knew where they went. Time passed. The year 1999 dragged on, but there was still no word from Melissa. Carl and Norma were beside themselves, praying for their daughter's safe return. With each passing month, their hope faded, but they clung to it desperately, like a lifeline. They couldn't imagine any solid reason why Melissa wouldn't call, especially since she had always stayed close with them, even through her turbulent youth. It felt like a nightmare they would soon wake up from. But the nightmare didn't end, and reality only grew darker. By January 2000, the Patton family's patience had worn thin. Norma filed a missing persons report with the police. Detectives began an investigation, and it wasn't long before they tracked down Melissa's husband, Christopher Wolfenberger. At the time of Melissa's disappearance, he had also been out of contact for a while, but eventually he reappeared. However, his wife and children were nowhere to be seen. Christopher claimed that Melissa had left on her own. According to him, she had been dreaming of a new life, of moving to California, and one day she just decided to make that dream a reality. But Norma and Carl knew their daughter. They were certain she would never do that, and she would never just disappear without saying a word. Despite the parents' firm belief that Christopher was hiding something, the police found no grounds to pursue further action. Melissa was an adult, and if she had decided to head to California, she had every right to do so. Since her husband hadn't reported her missing, the police saw no reason to classify her as a missing person. Without any evidence of a crime, the investigation hit a dead end. Christopher stuck to his story. Melissa had been planning the move for a while. She worked double shifts at the bakery, saving money, and sometimes even rented a hotel room to avoid the long commute home after exhausting hours. This, he said, was how she was preparing for the next chapter of her life. One day, she just didn't come back, and Christopher assumed she had finally gone through with her plan, leaving for California on her own. He insisted there was nothing unusual about it, explaining it as Melissa's desire to start fresh. Detectives tried to put pressure on Christopher, bringing up his past. Wolfenberger's youth was far from trouble-free. Melissa and I were like Bonnie and Clyde, just on a smaller scale, he smirked during questioning. They did get into minor trouble. Their life seemed to be a series of impulsive decisions, even before they got married. But it soon became clear that Christopher wasn't telling the whole truth. The records showed complaints filed by Melissa. She had reported incidents of domestic aggression multiple times. According to her, it wasn't just about him raising his hand against her. On one occasion, he allegedly gave her prohibited substances and dragged her down the street by her hair, ignoring her protests. When Christopher found out about these reports, he filed a counterclaim. The legal battle grew more complicated. At one of the hearings, Christopher asked for permission to speak with Melissa alone. After a brief conversation that no one else could hear, Melissa withdrew her complaint and returned home with him. "We have kids, after all," was all she said. After Melissa's disappearance, Christopher did something unexpected. He moved out of their shared home and went to stay with relatives. The kids stayed with their paternal grandmother, and Christopher only visited them occasionally. It seemed like he was trying to distance himself from his old life. Little Christina and Joy quickly adjusted to life without their mother, and they only thought of their father when he would show up at his mother's doorstep. Norma Patton had never liked Christopher. She believed he was the reason Melissa ran away from home shortly after finishing high school. To her, this marriage was nothing but a source of disappointment and heartache. "He was never who he pretended to be," she often said, staring at photos of her daughter. Now that Melissa was gone, Those words felt like a chilling prophecy. Her parents couldn't accept the idea that their daughter had simply walked away, leaving her life behind. What really happened to Melissa? And why were those who might have known the answer staying silent? As the fog of the past slowly lifted, a darker and more disturbing picture of the Wolfenberger family began to emerge, where happiness was nothing more than an illusion. In a conversation with detectives, Tina Patton recalled an incident from the past. She had noticed a bruise on Melissa's neck, shaped like a handprint. Melissa, usually composed and calm, broke down crying and begged Tina not to tell anyone. After that, one of Tina's friends wanted to confront Christopher man to man, but nothing ever came of it. It seemed like things had settled down, but it was only a facade of calm. Carl and Norma Patton couldn't accept the idea that their daughter had simply chosen to vanish without a word. Even if she had felt the need to leave her family, Melissa would have found a way to contact her parents. But as time passed, days and months turned into years, and there was still no trace of Melissa. A young woman, a mother of two, seemed to have disappeared into thin air. Christopher Wolfenberger, Melissa's husband, kept changing his statements. At first, he claimed the last time he saw Melissa was in December 1998, but during questioning in the spring of 2000, he suddenly stated that he had seen her on the street near their home in March or April of 1999. This inconsistency only deepened suspicions, but it didn't bring any clarity to the case. 5 years later, in 2003, the Patton family found themselves back in the spotlight. This time, it wasn't about Melissa, but Carl Patton himself. He had been arrested. It turned out that back in the mid-1980s, Carl had already had a run-in with the law. He served a short sentence for theft and was released on parole. Since then, he had tried to stay out of trouble, but his past caught up with him. More than 2 decades after the crime, his involvement was confirmed through DNA testing. On February 23, 2003, Carl was arrested for the death of 31-year-old Liddy Mae Evans. In 1977, her body was found in a river, wrapped in a sleeping bag and chained to a concrete block. The cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head. But this wasn't the only crime connected to Carl. Immediately after his arrest, Carl's wife, Norma, made a shocking announcement. She was willing to testify against her husband in exchange for immunity. The deal was made, and Norma began giving detailed testimonies that stunned everyone. According to her, between 1970 and 1977, Carl and his friend Joe Quint were involved in multiple crimes. It all started with the killing of Carl's uncle, Fred White, and his lover. Carl knew too much, and he convinced Norma to help eliminate any potential witnesses. Norma recounted how, on December 17, 1977, Carl lured his uncle and his uncle's lover to their home, where he used a shotgun to end their lives. Afterward, he and Norma wrapped the bodies in sleeping bags, attached weights, and dumped them in the river. Norma cleaned the house, washed away the blood, and Carl burned the blood-stained couch in the backyard. But the trunk of their van, which had blood stains, wasn't cleaned. When investigators found blood traces in the trunk matching the victim's blood type, Carl and Norma were questioned. But at the time, there wasn't enough evidence to press charges. It wasn't until 25 years later that DNA testing confirmed Carl's involvement. And on February 23, 2003, Melissa's father was taken into custody. After Carl's arrest, rumors began circulating about his possible connection to Melissa's disappearance. Some speculated that she might have been a victim of her own father, who couldn't risk anyone in the family talking. But there was no direct evidence to support this theory. Carl denied having anything to do with it, insisting, "I would never harm my daughter. I only dealt with those who threatened my family." But everyone knew there was a harsh truth hidden behind those words. The suspicions surrounding Carl weren't just about Melissa's disappearance. There were rumors that he had ties to criminal organizations operating in the southern U.S. as far back as the 1960s. He had a reputation as a cold-blooded shooter, but he always denied any involvement. In 2003, during the investigation into the death of Fred White and his lover, Norma revealed that Carl acted out of greed. The official marriage of Fred White entitled his wife to an insurance payout, and she had hired Carl to take care of her unfaithful husband. These old cases were handled by Detective Bruce Jordan. After 25 years, he was able to catch and convict Carl Patton, but it wasn't enough. Now Carl, sitting behind bars, reached out to Jordan with a plea: "Find my daughter. Find Melissa." This statement was unexpected, from a man who seemed to have no regrets. Suddenly, there was a concern for his missing daughter. For Norma and Tina, this brought a glimmer of hope, but also a wave of new fears. They worried that Melissa's disappearance was no accident, and that the mystery shrouded in darkness for so many years could turn out to be even more horrifying. When news of the renewed Wolfenberger case hit the papers, Detective Bruce Jordan immediately took interest. For years, the story seemed frozen, but a sudden lead from the Atlanta morgue changed everything. A forensic expert called Jordan and informed him that they had been holding unidentified remains in their facility for 4 years, body parts found in different months of 1999, in the area where Melissa's family lived. Back in April of that year, a severed head had been discovered near the Wolfenbergers' home. 2 months later, limbs, arms, and legs were found in a wooded area nearby, packaged in trash bags. The torso was never recovered, and the remains were initially declared to belong to a male because they couldn't be properly identified. At the time, Melissa had not yet been reported missing, and so these gruesome discoveries were not connected to her disappearance. It was only later that the horrifying truth emerged. Those remains belonged to her. When Bruce Jordan received the information, he picked up on crucial details. The head and limbs were found very close to the glass company where Christopher Wolfenberger had once worked. Norma Patton recalled hearing about the disturbing discoveries on the news, but back then, experts had assured everyone that the remains were male. It wasn't until years later, after DNA testing was performed, that it was confirmed. The dismembered body was Melissa. Carl Patton, Melissa's father, received the news while in prison. He couldn't hold back tears when he learned that her dismembered remains had been found shortly after she went missing, but had not been identified. What truly devastated him was the fact that the DNA testing, which could have brought clarity to his daughter's fate, wasn't conducted until after his arrest, nearly 4 years later. When Norma first reported Melissa missing in early 2000, her remains remained unidentified until 2003. Critical time was lost, along with vital evidence that might have solved the case much sooner. Forensic analysis revealed that Melissa's neck had been cut with a saw, and her skull had been treated with bleach, which initially led experts to believe the remains were male. The same chemical made it impossible to determine whether the injuries were inflicted before or after death. Her head and limbs were packed in trash bags and scattered along busy roads, making it nearly impossible to track the perpetrator's vehicle. The exact time and cause of death remained unknown, as her torso was never found. Christopher was brought in for questioning again once his wife was finally identified. He assured investigators that he had always been cooperative and had provided all possible information years ago. According to him, he had no motive to harm Melissa. There was no insurance policy, no assets, no debts. He emphasized that he would never have disposed of the remains near his workplace, knowing it would draw suspicion. Christopher even spoke to reporters, insisting that he genuinely believed Melissa had changed her name and started a new life somewhere, hoping that one day she would return, at least for the sake of their children. That was why he never filed a missing persons report. The loss hit Tina, Melissa's older sister, the hardest. To her, it wasn't just an unresolved case, but a constant, haunting pain. She even had nightmares where Melissa called out for help, but Tina couldn't reach her. Carl, sitting in prison, also changed. He wanted justice for his daughter, but he couldn't help. It seemed that losing Melissa was the first time he truly felt the pain that the families of his own victims had endured. The most shocking aspect of this story was that Carl, a convicted criminal, spent his final years fighting for justice for Melissa. Despite his apparent love for his daughter, her death remained a mystery. Her remains had been found, but there were no arrests, no charges. In 2017, Norma Patton reached out again, this time to Cheryl McCollum, an investigator specializing in cold cases. Cheryl, known for her true crime podcasts and shows, first met Norma at an official dinner. That evening, Norma approached her and, without hesitation, said, "My daughter was decapitated, and I need your help," and so began a new investigation. Cheryl McCollum knew the case wouldn't be easy, and immediately suggested to Norma that they re-examine all the evidence. She organized a new search of the wooded area where the bags with remains had been found years ago, trying to piece together fragments of the puzzle, hoping to find even a single new clue. But so far, the efforts had not been successful. Norma wasn't ready to give up. She believed that the truth about her daughter's death would eventually come to light, and Cheryl continued to dig into Melissa Wolfenberger's case, searching for that one missing piece that could reveal the whole story. When investigator Cheryl McCollum began her work, she could hardly have imagined just how many dark corners she would have to illuminate. From the start, she was able to establish correspondence with Carl Patton, Melissa's father. In his letters, Carl shared personal memories and his thoughts on who he believed was responsible for his daughter's disappearance. The one name he kept mentioning over and over was her husband, Christopher Wolfenberger. Carl had no illusions about his son-in-law. He believed that Christopher had ruined his daughter's life from the moment they met. Once, Melissa had been a bright, cheerful person, but everything changed when Christopher entered her life. According to Carl, it was Christopher who coaxed her into sneaking out of the house at night to meet him, taught her to steal, and twice tried to steal Carl's car to run off to California with Melissa. When she became pregnant and had their daughter, his control over her became absolute. He worked to isolate her from her parents, and the only time Norma and Carl ever saw their granddaughter, Christina, was when Christopher was at work. Melissa spoke in a frightened whisper, saying she would be in big trouble if her husband found out her parents had visited. Carl recalled how, despite the constant bruises on her arms and neck left by Christopher, Melissa wouldn't listen to his warnings. She believed she could get her life back on track, but when she didn't show up for Christmas, Carl knew something had gone terribly wrong. He was convinced Christopher was involved in her disappearance, but proving it was another matter entirely. What tormented Carl the most was knowing that his grandchildren didn't understand that their mother hadn't left to start a new life, but that she was gone for good. In his letters, Carl described how he tried to assist the investigation, despite being behind bars. He urged the experts to examine the trash bags containing the remains for any DNA traces, suggesting that whoever tied the knots might have left evidence. "There's no such thing as a perfect crime," he wrote, but the police were never able to find any proof linking Christopher to the case. Carl held on to the hope that the investigation would eventually yield results. Cheryl McCollum met with Norma several times, where she shared her suspicions in detail. Norma was convinced that Christopher was behind her daughter's death. Carl's letters reflected his desire to uncover the truth. He was willing to cooperate, despite his reputation as a convicted criminal. However, detectives still couldn't connect Christopher to Melissa's disappearance. At the end of one of his letters, Carl thanked Cheryl for her efforts, noting that he had only come to understand the gravity of his own crimes after losing his daughter. It took experiencing that kind of loss for him to grasp what the families of his victims had felt. He prayed that his grandchildren would one day learn the truth about their mother. Cheryl McCollum also explored the possibility of involving the children of Liddy Evans, one of Carl's victims, to see if any relatives might have had a motive for revenge. The police considered the theory that someone connected to Carl's past crimes might have sought retaliation, but this hypothesis quickly fell apart. Carl's crimes only came to light years after Melissa's disappearance. Liddy's children agreed to be interviewed on a podcast to discuss her story, as they believed Melissa also deserved justice, despite the fact that her father was a criminal. One of the forensic experts, Joseph Morgan, spoke about the autopsy findings. He speculated that Melissa's dismemberment might not have occurred at home, but rather at the glass company where Christopher worked. The remains were found at a dump site near the building, and all the necessary tools for such an act were available on the premises. However, the police found no blood or DNA traces at the facility, which prevented them from confirming this theory. It remained unclear where the crime had taken place and, most importantly, who was responsible for it. Cheryl made sure not to overlook even the smallest details. She brought in specialists, reviewed all the case materials, and kept a constant correspondence with Carl. All the experts seemed to agree on one thing. The most likely suspect remained Christopher. McCollum stated she was willing to put her reputation on the line to see the perpetrator brought to justice. Melissa's story was the first one she covered on her podcast, launched in February 2023. Then, in April 2024, a listener contacted her claiming to have witnessed a confrontation between Melissa and Christopher at a party. This information breathed new life into the case, giving it fresh momentum. Investigators jumped back into action with renewed energy. In early August, after more than 2 decades of uncertainty, Christopher Wolfenberger was arrested on suspicion of a serious crime. Detectives revisited old leads, re-interviewed witnesses, and used new technology to piece everything together. When officers arrived at his home, he tried to hide behind a dryer. "Not the behavior of an innocent man," one of the officers commented. Christopher continued to maintain his innocence, but the charges were already in place. Norma and Tina were present at the press conference. Norma clasped her hands and quietly prayed when she heard the announcement of the arrest. "Now he's behind bars," she said, standing before the cameras, "and I hope he stays there." The police did not disclose all the evidence that led to the arrest, and Christopher's motives were still unclear. But one thing was certain: 25 years after Melissa's disappearance, Her family finally had hope that justice would prevail. I shared this story with you because even after years pass and everything seems lost, the truth has a way of resurfacing. The Patton family fought for their daughter despite all the challenges and public scrutiny, and their perseverance was rewarded. This case shows that wrongdoing cannot be ignored. Families facing abusive behavior often find themselves in desperate situations, but silence and hiding the truth are not the answers. If Melissa could speak to you now, she would say, "Don't let yourself be broken. Seek justice."